The buzzards were already circling when Minerva Blackwood spotted the dust cloud closing fast behind her. 3 riders, maybe 4, their horses' hoofbeats pounding across the hardpan like thunder before a storm. She'd been running since dawn, her mare's flanks slick with sweat and foam. But the pursuers were gaining ground with every mile. Her horse stumbled on loose shale, nearly throwing her from the saddle. Behind her, the riders were close enough now that she could hear their voices' harsh, men's laughter carried on the desert wind like the sound of breaking bones. They were enjoying the chase, taking their time with her like cats playing with a wounded mouse. That's when she saw them. 3 small forms huddled against a red boulder, so still they might have been corpses already. Minerva hauled hard on the reins, her horse sliding to a stop in a spray of sand and gravel. The approaching riders were less than a mile back now, close enough that she could make out their silhouettes against the blazing Arizona sky, dark shapes wavering in the heat shimmer like demons rising from hell itself. The oldest girl, maybe 16, with sun-bleached hair matted with blood and dirt, lifted her head as Minerva dismounted. Her lips were cracked and bleeding skin blistered from the merciless sun, but her eyes burned with fierce determination that reminded Minerva painfully of her own dead son. "Don't stop for us." The girl croaked, her voice like sandpaper on wood. "They're coming. They'll kill you too." Minerva glanced back at the dust cloud, measuring distance and time with the practiced eye of someone who'd survived 20 years in Apache country. The riders would be on them in minutes. Her mare was spent, couldn't carry 4 people, and there was nowhere to run in this open country. The youngest girl couldn't be more than 9, lay motionless in the shade of the boulder, her small chest barely rising and falling. Her lips were blue-white skin, hot as a stove iron. Heat exhaustion may be worse. The middle girl was conscious, but delirious, mumbling about water and shadows and blood on the walls. "Like hell I'm leaving you," Minerva muttered, pulling her canteen free. The water was warm as tea, but it was life itself to these dying children. "Can you ride?" "Emma," the oldest girl whispered, as Minerva poured precious drops between her cracked lips. "I'm Emma Hartwell. These are my sisters Sarah and Lila." The name hit Minerva like a physical blow. Hartwell. She'd heard the rumors in Esperanza. 3 days past, a family found slaughtered on their homestead, burned out by Apache raiders. But the gossips had said there were no survivors, that the Indians had taken everything. "The marshal said you were all dead," Minerva said, lifting little Lila into her arms. The child was burning with fever, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Marshal Brennan killed Mama and Papa." Emma gasped, struggling to her feet, on legs that shook like winter branches. "We saw him do it. We watched from the loft while he put bullets in them both. That's why they're hunting us." The thunder of hoofbeats was getting closer, echoing off the canyon walls like the drums of an approaching war party. Minerva could hear voices now, men calling to each other across the desert, coordinating their hunt with military precision. "Shot them down like dogs." Emma continued, her voice growing stronger with rage. "Then they searched the house, looking for something Papa had hidden. When they couldn't find it, they decided to burn everything and blame it on Apache." "Oh, but you got away," Minerva said, checking her pistol and rifle. 6 rounds in the Colt, maybe 15 in the Winchester. Not nearly enough against 3 or 4 mounted gunmen. "We ran," Sarah whispered, the middle sister's eyes focusing for the first time. "Ran and ran until we couldn't anymore. Haven't had water in 2 days." That's when the war cry split the air. From the maze of red rocks to their north came the distinctive whistle of Apache arrows, followed by the screams of horses and men. The pursuing riders had run straight into an ambush, their triumphant chase turning into a nightmare of death and pain. "This way," a voice said in accented English. An Apache warrior emerged from behind a boulder, tall, lean, with intelligent dark eyes and graying hair bound with leather cord. quickly before more come." Minerva recognized him immediately. Nalnish, chief of the Desert Wind Band. 3 years ago, she'd pulled an infected arrow from his sister's shoulder when the Apache woman had collapsed near her ranch, burning with fever and half dead from poison. He'd never forgotten the debt, though they'd barely spoken since. "Can you walk?" Nalnish asked Emma, his tone gentle but urgent. The girl nodded, though she swayed on her feet like a sapling in high wind. Between them, Minerva and Nalnish got the three sisters to a hidden canyon where several Apache warriors waited with horses and water and the blessed shade of overhanging rock. "Why are they hunting children?" Nalnish asked, as his men tended to the girls with quiet efficiency. "Because Marshal Brennan isn't just a lawman," Minerva replied grimly, accepting a water gourd from one of the warriors. "He's running some kind of murder operation, and these girls witnessed him kill their parents." The Apache chief's face darkened like storm clouds gathering over the mountains. "Corrupt white law. It is an old story, but always it brings death to the innocent." The hidden canyon where Nalnish had brought them was a natural fortress, narrow entrance, high walls, fresh water seeping from cracks in the red stone. Minerva had lived in Arizona territory for 23 years, but she'd never seen this place. The Apache kept their secrets well. Emma was recovering faster than her sisters, the tough resilience of youth asserting itself now that she had water and shade. As color returned to her cheeks, her story came out in fits and starts, fragments of horror that painted a picture of systematic evil. It wasn't random. She insisted, sitting cross-legged on a blanket while one of Nalnish's warriors tended to cuts on her feet. Marshal Brennan came to our house looking for something specific. Papers that Papa had found. "What kind of papers?" Minerva asked, though part of her already dreaded the answer. "Land grants, mining claims, letters from officials in Tucson." Emma's voice was steady now, but her hands shook as she described what she'd seen. "Papa said they proved that important men were stealing from settlers, taking their land, and selling it to rich folks back east." Minerva felt ice form in her stomach. If Emma was right, they weren't just dealing with one corrupt official, they were up against a network of criminals with the power of the territorial government behind them. "Where are these papers now?" she asked. "Papa hid them before the marshal came," Emma replied. "Made me memorize the location, said if anything happened to him and Mama, I should only tell someone I trusted with my life." The weight of that trust settled on Minerva's shoulders like a physical burden. These three girls, orphaned, hunted, traumatized, were looking to her for protection she wasn't sure she could provide. At 43, she was no longer the young woman who'd fought claim jumpers and survived Apache raids. Her husband Tom was 20 years in the ground, her son Samuel nearly as long. She'd grown used to solitude, to caring only for herself and her small ranch. But looking at Emma's determined face, at Sarah's quiet courage as she helped tend little Lila, Minerva felt something stir in her chest that she'd thought was buried with her family. The fierce, protective instinct of a mother wolf ready to die fighting for her cubs. "This goes deeper than just land fraud," she said, pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fit together in her mind. "My husband Tom was killed 20 years ago. Claim jumpers, they said, but the circumstances never made sense. He was too careful, too smart to be caught off guard like that." Nalnish had been listening silently, but now he spoke. "Your husband? He was the one who treated sick animals without payment, who shared grain with Apache ponies when the grass was poor." Minerva nodded, surprised that the Apache chief remembered Tom at all. "He believed all living things deserved kindness. A good man," Nalnish said simply. "His death was no accident. I have heard stories, whispers among my people about white men who kill for money, who steal land, and blame Apache for the blood." The implication hit Minerva like a sledgehammer. Tom hadn't died because of claim jumpers. He'd been murdered by the same conspiracy that had killed the Hartwell family. The thought that her husband's death had meaning beyond random frontier violence was both devastating and oddly comforting. "How many men does Brennan have?" she asked, forcing herself to focus on immediate survival. "Hard to say," Emma replied. "I saw at least 6 at our house, but there were others waiting outside. And Papa said the corruption went all the way to the territorial capital." The sound of approaching riders echoed off the canyon walls, not the chaotic noise of men in full pursuit, but the measured pace of a search party that had found what it was looking for. "Mrs. Blackwood." Marshal Brennan's voice boomed across the desert, amplified by the canyon's acoustics. "I know you're in there. Send out the Hartwell girls, and no one else has to die today." Nalnish's warriors took positions among the rocks, their movements silent as shadows. But Minerva could see the tactical problem they faced. The canyon's narrow entrance was easy to defend, but it was also a trap. If Brennan had enough men and enough patience, he could simply wait them out. "You're harboring fugitives, ma'am." Brennan continued his voice, carrying the false authority of corrupted law. "These girls are wanted for questioning in connection with their parents' murder. They're material witnesses to Apache atrocities." Emma's bitter laugh cut through the desert air. "Material witnesses to you putting bullets in innocent people? That's a serious accusation, little girl." Brennan called back. "You sure you want to make it? Apache don't take kindly to being blamed for white men's crimes. Might decide to eliminate some witnesses of their own." The threat was clear and clever. Brennan was trying to turn Nalnish against them, suggesting that protecting the girls would bring military retaliation on the Apache band. But Nalnish's response was immediate and final. "The children speak truth. We will not abandon them to murderers." Minerva felt a surge of gratitude toward the Apache chief, but also a growing sense of doom. They were trapped in a canyon with limited ammunition, facing an enemy with superior numbers and unlimited resources. Worse, every hour they delayed gave Brennan more time to bring in reinforcements. "What do you really want, Brennan?" she called out, hoping to buy time while she thought of a plan. "I want those girls to come peacefully for questioning. And I want to know where James Hartwell hid the documents he stole from the Territorial Land Office." So that was it. The evidence Emma's father had gathered was still out there, and as long as it existed, Brennan and his conspirators would never be safe. They couldn't simply kill the girls and claim Apache attack. They needed to know where the papers were hidden, even if we had those documents. Minerva replied, "What makes you think we'd hand them over to the man they incriminate?" Brennan's laugh was cold as winter wind. "Because if you don't, a lot more innocent people are going to die. You think this is just about 3 orphan girls, Mrs. Blackwood? I've got men in every town from here to Tucson. Cross me, and every settler, shopkeeper, and rancher who's ever shown you kindness will pay the price." The threat was real, and Minerva knew it. Brennan had the resources and connections to make good on his promise. But she also knew that handing over the girls and the evidence would just mean they'd die quietly instead of noisily. Sarah spoke up for the first time since they'd reached the canyon. "He's lying about the Apache attacks. Papa kept records every Indian raid in the territory for the past 5 years. Most of them happened to families who'd found gold or good water. Families who wouldn't sell to the land speculators." The 13-year-old's words carried the weight of careful observation. She might be the quiet one, but she'd been paying attention to her father's work. "Smart girl," Nalnish said approvingly. "Your father was wise to teach you to see patterns." He said the truth was usually simple. Sarah continued, "Bad men kill good people to steal their land. Then they blame Apache so no one asks hard questions." Emma nodded fiercely. "Papa found proof. Names, dates, money changing hands. He was going to take it to the federal marshals in Tucson, but Brennan found out first." Little Lila stirred in her feverish sleep, mumbling words that made everyone freeze. "Mama said run to the silver mine. Papa's papers are in the silver mine." The child's delirious words hit the group like a thunderbolt. Emma went white as a sheet, realizing her baby sister had just revealed the location of the evidence that could destroy Brennan's conspiracy and potentially signed all their death warrants. The old Esperanza mine. Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Papa used to take us there on Sundays, said it was the only place in the territory where a man could think clearly. Minerva knew the mine, an abandoned silver operation about 15 miles north, played out and dangerous. If James Hartwell had hidden his evidence there, it would be almost impossible to retrieve without proper equipment and considerable risk. Did he say which shaft? She asked urgently. Number 3, Emma replied. He always said it was his lucky number. The conversation was interrupted by the distinctive crack of rifle fire from the canyon entrance. One of Nalnish's warriors called out in Apache, his voice tight with alarm. They're not waiting for negotiations. Nalnish translated grimly. Brennan has more men than we thought, maybe 20 riders. They're surrounding the canyon. Minerva felt the trap closing around them like iron jaws. Brennan had outmaneuvered them completely, using the negotiations as a distraction while positioning his forces for a coordinated assault. In minutes, they'd be facing rifle fire from multiple directions with no hope of escape. There's another way out, Nalnish said quietly, reading the desperation in her face. Ancient path up the back wall. Very dangerous, especially for children, but possible. Emma was already on her feet, helping Sarah gather their few possessions. We have to try. If Brennan gets those papers, he'll kill everyone who knows about them, not just us, Sarah added with chilling clarity. Everyone Papa talked to, everyone who might have seen something, the whole town of Esperanza if necessary. The scope of the conspiracy was becoming clearer. This wasn't just about covering up a few murders. It was about protecting a criminal enterprise worth millions of dollars in stolen land and resources. Brennan and his backers would kill hundreds of people to keep their secrets safe. The path is narrow, Nalnish warned, already moving toward the back of the canyon. One person at a time. If someone falls, he didn't need to finish. A fall from the canyon wall meant death, plain and simple. Little Lila was awake now, her fever broken, but still weak from dehydration. She looked around with the confused clarity of a child emerging from nightmare into a waking world that was somehow worse. Where's Mama? She asked the question that had been waiting in her throat for days. Emma knelt beside her baby sister, tears streaming down her face. Mama and Papa are gone, Lila, but we're going to be safe. Mrs. Minerva and the Apache are going to help us. The 9-year-old absorbed this information with the strange resilience of childhood. Are we going home? We're going to find a new home, Minerva said, gently lifting the child into her arms. Somewhere safe where bad men can't hurt us. The rifle fire was intensifying now, bullets ricocheting off the canyon walls with deadly whines. Brennan's men were testing the Apache defenses, probing for weak points in their position. We need to move now, Nalnish said urgently. My warriors will hold them as long as possible, but... His words were cut off by a new sound and the thunder of many horses approaching from the south. Reinforcements for Brennan, or something else entirely. But Federal cavalry, one of the Apache scouts called out in English. 24 riders, maybe more. The news should have been welcomed the arrival of legitimate law enforcement to restore order. But Minerva felt only growing dread. If Brennan had connections throughout the territorial government, he might well have allies in the military as well. Mrs. Blackwood. A new voice echoed across the canyon, carrying the crisp authority of military command. This is Colonel Harrison, United States Army. I'm ordering you to surrender those children immediately. Emma's face went pale. How does he know we're here? How does he know you have us? The answer was obvious and terrifying. Someone had told the colonel exactly where to find them, which meant Brennan's corruption reached into the highest levels of territorial authority. We go now, Nalnish said flatly, already leading them toward the treacherous path up the canyon wall. Army or no army, these children are not safe in white man's custody. As they began the dangerous climb, rifle fire erupted from multiple directions. Brennan's men were attacking the Apache positions while the cavalry surrounded the canyon from the outside. Caught between two forces, Nalnish's warriors were fighting for their lives against overwhelming odds. Halfway up the cliff face, clinging to handholds barely wide enough for fingertips, Minerva heard Emma gasp in recognition. "That's not Colonel Harrison." The girl whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I've seen him before at our house talking to Papa about mining claims. His name is Mitchell, and Papa said he was one of the crooked ones." The revelation turned everything upside down. The federal cavalry wasn't legitimate law enforcement at all. It was more of Brennan's conspiracy dressed in military uniforms to give their actions the appearance of legal authority. "How many people are part of this?" Sarah asked, her young voice full of horror at the scope of the corruption. "Too many," Minerva replied grimly, helping little Lila navigate a particularly difficult section of the climb. "But maybe not all of them. Your father found evidence because someone was willing to talk. There have to be honest men left in the territory." They reached the top of the canyon, just as the battle below reached its climax. Looking down, Minerva could see Nalnish and his warriors making their last stand against impossible odds. The Apache were outnumbered 4-1, but they were fighting with the desperation of men protecting their honor and their promises. "We can't leave them," Emma said fiercely, though tears streamed down her face. "We have to," Nalnish called up from below, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. "Protect the children. That is what matters now. The truth they carry is worth more than our lives." A rifle bullet sparked off the rock near Minerva's head, reminding her that they were still in mortal danger. Brennan's men had spotted their escape route and were already scrambling up the canyon walls in pursuit. "Run," she told the girls. "Run like your lives depend on it, because they do." The desert beyond the canyon was a moonscape of broken rock and shifting sand, offering no cover from the blazing sun or the bullets of their pursuers. Minerva led the three girls in a desperate flight across terrain that seemed designed to kill anything foolish enough to traverse it on foot. Little Lila, despite her youth and recent illness, proved surprisingly resilient. The 9-year-old scrambled over rocks and through arroyos with the sure-footed agility of a mountain goat, her small size actually an advantage in the rough terrain. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit were growing closer. Brennan's men had horses, but the broken ground forced them to move carefully, giving the fugitives a temporary reprieve from the relentless chase. "There," Emma panted, pointing toward a cluster of towering red rocks about a mile ahead. "If we can reach those formations, we might be able to hide." Minerva checked the sun's position mid-afternoon with maybe 4 hours of daylight left. In the desert, darkness could be either salvation or death, depending on how prepared you were for the brutal cold that followed the searing heat. They'd lost their water in the canyon, along with most of their supplies. The girls were already showing signs of dehydration, despite their earlier recovery, and Minerva knew they couldn't last another day without finding water. "Mrs. Minerva," Sarah said quietly, "I think I know where we can get help." The 13-year-old had been silent during their flight, but now she spoke with the careful precision of someone who'd been thinking hard about their situation. "Papa used to talk about a man named Joaquin Morales, who lived near the old mine. Said he was one of the few honest men left in the territory, someone who wouldn't be bought or scared off by the land grabbers." Emma nodded eagerly. "I remember him. Papa said Senor Morales lost his ranch to crooked land deals, but he stayed in the area anyway. Said someone had to bear witness to what was happening. It was thin hope, but it was better than nothing. If they could reach this Morales and convince him to help, they might have a chance of retrieving the hidden evidence and getting it to legitimate authorities." "How far to his place?" Minerva asked, helping little Lila over a particularly challenging stretch of loose shale. "Maybe 10 miles north of the mine," Emma replied. Papa said he lived in an old prospector's cabin, practically invisible unless you knew where to look. The sound of gunfire erupted behind them, not the sharp crack of rifle shots, but the deeper boom of a shotgun. Someone else had joined the fight, and from the shouting that followed, it wasn't good news for Brennan's men. Apache, Sarah said with grim satisfaction. Some of Nalnish's warriors got away from the canyon. The knowledge that their Apache protectors were still fighting gave the fleeing group new energy. They pushed harder across the desert, using every fold in the terrain to stay hidden from their mounted pursuers. As they climbed toward the red rock formations, Minerva caught sight of movement on their back trail. 3 riders were following their tracks, with the patient persistence of professional manhunters. These weren't the impatient gunmen who'd attacked the canyon. These were specialists, the kind of men who could track a wounded deer across granite. "They're still coming," she warned the girls. Emma looked back at the distant riders, her young face hard with determination. "Then we don't stop. We can't stop until we reach the mine and get Papa's evidence. Even then," Sarah added quietly, "we need to get it to someone who can't be bought or threatened. Someone outside the territory." The wisdom of the 13-year-old's words struck Minerva like a physical blow. Even if they retrieved James Hartwell's documents proving the conspiracy's existence, they'd still need to find someone in authority who wasn't part of the criminal network. They reached the red rocks as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The formation was larger than it had appeared from a distance, a maze of towering spires and hidden canyons that could conceal an army if necessary. "Water," little Lila whispered the first complaint she'd made during their entire flight. Minerva felt the child's forehead and cursed silently. Lila's fever was returning, brought on by dehydration and exhaustion. They needed to find water soon, or the youngest Hartwell sister would die in the desert that had already claimed too many innocent lives. "There might be a spring in these rocks," she said, trying to sound more hopeful than she felt. Desert formations like this sometimes collect rainwater in natural basins. They searched frantically among the towering stones, following every shadow that might indicate water. Emma found at first a tiny seep that had created a pool no bigger than a dinner plate. But it was clean water, filtered through tons of sandstone. As they took turns drinking the precious liquid, Minerva caught sight of their pursuers again. The 3 riders had reached the base of the rock formation and were studying the ground with professional attention. "Oh, they're good," she admitted grudgingly. "They'll find our trail eventually. Then we need to give them something else to follow," Emma said, her young mind working with tactical clarity that would have impressed a cavalry officer. The 16-year-old began gathering rocks, building what looked like a crude shelter in a visible alcove. To casual observation, it would appear that the fugitives had decided to make a stand in the rocks. Meanwhile, Sarah led little Lila deeper into the formation, following a narrow passage that wound between towering spires toward the back of the maze. It was a desperate gambit. If the trackers weren't fooled, they'd be trapped with no way out. The decoy worked better than anyone had hoped. The 3 riders approached the fake shelter with rifles ready, clearly planning to end the chase with overwhelming firepower. But when they reached the alcove, they found only rocks and shadows. "Clever little bitch," one of them snarled, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. They doubled back somehow. "Maybe," replied a second voice, "but tracks don't lie. They came this way and they didn't leave. They're still in these rocks somewhere." The third man was silent, but Minerva could hear him moving through the formation with the careful steps of an experienced tracker. He was methodically searching every hiding place, every shadow that could conceal a child. "Found something," he called out eventually. "Blood on the rocks. One of them is hurt." It was little Lila's blood drops from where she'd scraped her knee during their flight. The tracker was following their real trail now, and he was good enough to follow it all the way to their hiding place. Emma looked at Minerva with desperate eyes. "We have to run again." "Where?" Minerva asked. "They'll just follow our tracks." Not if we split up, the 16-year-old replied with heartbreaking courage. I'll lead them away from you and my sisters. You get Sarah and Lila to safety. Absolutely not, Minerva said firmly. We stay together or we die together. That's when they heard the war cry. Not the distinctive Apache call they'd heard before, but something different than the wild, ululating shriek of Comanche warriors on the warpath. The sound echoed off the rock walls like the voice of the desert itself, full of savage promise and ancient fury. The 3 trackers responded with immediate panic, their confident professionalism dissolving into terror. Comanche in Arizona territory was unusual, but not impossible. Raiding parties sometimes ranged far from their traditional hunting grounds, especially when pursuing stolen horses or seeking revenge. Jesus Christ. One of the trackers gasped. How many of them are there? The answer came in the form of arrows whistling through the air, followed by the screams of wounded horses and dying men. But something was wrong with the sounds. They were too perfectly timed, too theatrical. Real Comanche attacks were swift and silent, not the prolonged spectacle they were hearing. Emma caught Minerva's eye and smiled grimly. Nalnish, she whispered. The Apache chief had survived the canyon battle and followed their trail using Comanche war cries to terrify their pursuers. It was psychological warfare, at its finest, turning Brennan's men against each other with fear and confusion. By the time the fake attack ended, 2 of the 3 trackers were dead, and the 3rd was fleeing south at full gallop, convinced he'd barely escaped a Comanche war party. The immediate pursuit was broken, but Minerva knew it was only temporary. Brennan had too many resources to give up easily. We need to reach that mine before they regroup, she told the girls. Your father's evidence is our only hope of ending this. As they prepared to leave the red rocks, Nalnish appeared like a ghost from the desert, his face painted with war colors, and his rifle still smoking from recent combat. The canyon is lost, he reported quietly. But my warriors scattered as planned. Some will make it back to our people. And the others? Minerva asked, though she already knew the answer. They died with honor, Nalnish replied simply. Their sacrifice has meaning if these children live to speak truth. The weight of that responsibility settled on all their shoulders like a physical burden. Good men had died to protect 3 orphaned girls, and the evidence that could expose a territorial conspiracy. They couldn't let those deaths be meaningless. The journey to the Esperanza mine took 2 days of brutal travel across some of the harshest terrain in Arizona territory. They moved at night to avoid the heat and the searching eyes of Brennan's men, hiding in whatever shade they could find during the scorching daylight hours. Nalnish proved invaluable as a guide, leading them through hidden canyons and forgotten trails that existed only in Apache memory. His knowledge of the desert was encyclopedic: where to find water, which plants could provide nourishment, how to read the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in this unforgiving landscape. Little Lila had recovered from her fever, but the journey was taking its toll on all of them. They were surviving on cactus fruit and what little water they could find, their clothes torn and their skin burned despite their efforts to stay in shade. On the 2nd night, as they approached the mine, Emma finally revealed the full scope of what her father had discovered. It wasn't just land fraud, she said quietly as they rested in the ruins of an old prospector's camp. Papa found evidence of murder for hire, cattle rustling, even selling guns to Apache raiders so they'd attack the right homesteads. Sarah nodded grimly. He had names, dates, bank records, enough to send dozens of men to prison, including the territorial governor. That's why they're so desperate to stop us, Minerva realized. We're not just threatening individual criminals, we're threatening an entire criminal empire worth millions of dollars. The implications were staggering. If James Hartwell's evidence was as comprehensive as his daughters claimed, it could destroy the careers and fortunes of some of the most powerful men in the territory. The question is, Nalnish said thoughtfully, who can we trust with such evidence If corruption reaches so high, who has the authority and honesty to act on it? It was the question that had been haunting Minerva since their escape from the canyon. Even if they retrieved the documents, they'd need to find someone outside the territorial power structure to present them to. Federal marshals, Emma suggested. Papa said the territorial government reported to Washington, and there were federal officials who couldn't be bought by local interests. Maybe, Minerva replied doubtfully. But how do we contact them? How do we know which ones are honest? The answer came from an unexpected source. As they prepared to resume their journey, one of Nalnish's scouts appeared with urgent news. "We were riders coming from the south," he reported in Apache. "Many of them. They have the mine surrounded." Nalnish's expression darkened as he translated. "Brennan found the mine ahead of us. He's waiting." The news was devastating. They'd endured 2 days of brutal travel only to find their destination in enemy hands. Worse, Brennan's presence at the mine meant he'd probably figured out where the evidence was hidden. Maybe not. Emma said, her voice tight with desperate hope. Papa was careful about hiding places. Even if they know the right shaft, they'd need to know exactly where to look. And they'd need someone who understands mining, Sarah added. Papa said the old workings were dangerous cave-ins, bad air, flooded tunnels. A wrong step could kill you. Minerva felt a glimmer of hope. If the Hartwell evidence was hidden in a location that required specific knowledge to reach safely, Brennan might be having trouble retrieving it. "We need to get closer," she decided. "See what the situation really is." They approached the mine in the pre-dawn darkness, using every skill Nalnish had taught them about moving unseen through hostile territory. The old mining operation sprawled across a hillside like a mechanical cancer, its abandoned buildings and rusted equipment creating a maze of shadows and hiding places. Brennan had positioned his men well, sentries at all the approaches, guards at each mine entrance, a command post in the old assay office. From their hiding place in a cluster of tumbled rocks, Minerva counted at least 15 men, all heavily armed and clearly professionals. "There," Sarah whispered, pointing toward shaft number 3. "That's where Papa hid the papers." The entrance to the third shaft was under heavy guard, 4 men with rifles positioned to cover all approaches. But more telling was the activity around the opening itself. Men were coming and going with mining equipment, lanterns, and rope. They were searching but carefully aware of the dangers involved. "They haven't found it yet," Emma breathed. "Papa's hiding place is still safe." That's when they saw him. James Hartwell emerged from the mine shaft, very much alive, his hands bound behind his back and a rifle pressed to his spine. The girl's father, the man they'd watched die in a hail of bullets, was Brennan's prisoner. Emma's gasp of shock nearly gave away their position. Sarah grabbed her sister's arm, pulling her down behind the rocks as little Lila stared in confused wonder. "Papa." She whispered the word barely audible. Minerva felt the world shift beneath her feet. If James Hartwell was alive, it meant everything they'd believed about the attack on their homestead was wrong. But it also meant something else. Their mother was probably alive too, and both parents were in the hands of murderous criminals. The blood. Emma whispered, her voice shaking with realization. "We saw so much blood, but maybe they used pig's blood or something to make it look real." Sarah's eyes were wide with desperate hope. But why would they fake Papa and Mama's deaths? Why not just kill them for real? The answer was obvious and terrifying. "Because they need your parents alive to find the evidence," Minerva said grimly. "Dead men can't tell you where they hid important documents." From their hiding spot, they watched as Brennan emerged from the mine shaft, his face dark with frustration. Even at this distance, they could see he was angry. The search wasn't going well. "I'll bring the woman," Brennan ordered one of his men. A few minutes later, another figure was dragged from one of the abandoned mining buildings. Margaret Hartwell, the girl's mother, was alive, but clearly suffering. Her dress was torn, her face bruised, and she moved with the careful gait of someone in pain. Little Lila started to cry silently. tears streaming down her dirty face as she watched her parents being used as pawns in Brennan's deadly game. "We have to save them," Emma said fiercely. "We can't just watch while what?" Minerva interrupted gently. "While we get ourselves killed trying to rescue them from 15 armed men, your parents are alive because Brennan needs them. If we're captured too, he'll have no reason to keep any of you breathing." It was harsh logic, but it was also accurate. Their only hope lay in staying free long enough to get help, real help, from authorities outside Brennan's corrupt network. Nalnish had been studying the mine's layout with a warrior's tactical eye. "There might be another way into Shaft 3, he said quietly. Old mining operations often had ventilation shafts escape routes. If we could find another entrance. Papa mentioned old workings, Sarah said suddenly. He said the mine had been worked from both sides of the hill, but most people only knew about the main entrances. It was a desperate chance, but it was better than trying to fight their way through Brennan's defensive positions. If they could reach the evidence without being detected, they might be able to turn it into leverage for the Hartwell's release. "You three stay here," Minerva decided. "Nalnish and I will search for another way in." "No," Emma said firmly. "I'm the only one who knows exactly where Papa hid the papers. You need me." Before Minerva could argue, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their planning. A new group of riders was approaching the mine, not Brennan's men, but something that looked suspiciously like a military patrol. Federal cavalry. Sarah breathed hope creeping into her voice, but Minerva's blood ran cold as she recognized the lead rider. Colonel Mitchell, the man who'd posed as federal authority at the canyon, the man Emma had identified as one of the corrupt officials her father had been investigating. "That's not cavalry," she said grimly. "That's more of Brennan's conspiracy dressed up to look official." The new arrivals dismounted near the mine's command post, and even from their distant hiding place, the watchers could hear heated voices. Brennan and Mitchell were arguing about something, their disagreement loud enough to carry across the desert air. "Told you to handle this quietly?" Mitchell was saying. "Half the territory knows something's happening up here. People are asking questions." "People can ask all the questions they want," Brennan replied coldly. "Dead men don't give answers. And what about the Apache? You've stirred up 3 different bands with your heavy-handed tactics. The real military is getting involved now." Brennan's laugh was harsh as breaking glass. "Let them come. By the time they sort out what's really happening, we'll have the evidence, and this whole mess will be cleaned up." The argument revealed the scope of the conspiracy's desperation. They were willing to risk open warfare with Apache bands and federal intervention to recover James Hartwell's evidence. Whatever he'd discovered, it was worth starting a small war to suppress. "How long do we have?" Mitchell asked. "Maybe 6 hours before the real cavalry arrives from Fort Huachuca," Brennan replied. "More than enough time to finish this." 6 hours. It wasn't much time to mount a rescue operation, retrieve hidden evidence, and escape with their lives. But it was all they had. As the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, Minerva made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "We split up," she told the group. "Nalnish and I will create a distraction at the main entrance while you girls find the back way into Shaft 3. Get your father's evidence and get out. Don't wait for us." Emma's protest was immediate and fierce. "We're not abandoning you. You're not abandoning us," Minerva replied gently. "You're completing the mission. Those documents are more important than any of our lives. They're the only thing that can stop this conspiracy and save other innocent families." It was a hard truth, but it was the truth nonetheless. The evidence James Hartwell had hidden represented the hopes and lives of countless settlers who'd been murdered, robbed and driven from their land by Brennan's criminal network. Nalnish nodded approvingly. "The woman speaks wisdom, but the distraction must be convincing or the children will walk into a trap." What kind of distraction? Sarah asked. Minerva checked her rifle and pistol, making sure both weapons were fully loaded. The kind that makes Brennan think we're trying to rescue your parents through the front door. The plan was simple, desperate, and probably suicidal. But it was also the only chance they had of success. Minerva and Nalnish would launch what appeared to be a rescue attempt at the main mine entrance, drawing all of Brennan's attention and firepower. Meanwhile, the three girls would circle around to the back of the hill and search for an alternate route into Shaft 3, if we don't make it out. Minerva told Emma quietly. You get that evidence to someone who can act on it. Someone outside the territory if necessary. Promise me. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. I promise. But you better make it out, Mrs. Minerva. We need you. The words hit Minerva harder than any bullet could have. For the first time in 20 years, someone needed her not just as a temporary ally or convenient helper, but as family. These three girls had become her daughters in every way that mattered, and she'd be damned if she'd let them face the world alone again. I'll see you on the other side of this hill, she promised. All of us together. As the girls began their dangerous journey around the mine, Minerva and Nalnish prepared for what might be their final battle. They had maybe a dozen rifle rounds between them, facing 15 heavily armed criminals with defensive positions and superior firepower. Good day to die, Nalnish said quietly, checking his weapons with the calm efficiency of a veteran warrior. A good day to live, Minerva corrected. We're going home after this. The Apache chief smiled grimly. Then we fight like men who have something to live for. The attack began at high noon, when the desert sun was at its most merciless and every shadow was precious as gold. Minerva and Nalnish had positioned themselves on a ridge overlooking the mine's main entrance, their rifles trained on Brennan's command post. Remember, Minerva whispered, we're not trying to win this fight. We're trying to make enough noise to draw every man away from Shaft 3. Nalnish nodded, his face painted with war colors that seemed to shift and flow in the shimmering heat. The children will need at least an hour to find the evidence and escape. An hour. It seemed impossible to hold the attention of 15 professional killers for that long with just 2 rifles and limited ammunition. But they had to try. Minerva's first shot took one of Brennan's sentries in the shoulder, sending him spinning to the ground with a scream that echoed off the mine buildings. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Rifle fire erupted from every defensive position, turning the hillside into a storm of lead and death. Apache attack, someone shouted from the mine. They found us. It was exactly the reaction Minerva had hoped for. Brennan's men were responding to what they thought was an Indian raid, which meant they'd concentrate their forces and firepower on the obvious threat. For 20 minutes, the battle raged with the desperate intensity of men fighting for their lives. Minerva and Nalnish moved constantly, never firing from the same position twice, making their small force seem larger and more threatening than it really was. But as their ammunition dwindled and Brennan's men began to organize a coordinated counterattack, Minerva realized something was wrong. The girls should have reached Shaft 3 by now, should have been inside the mine searching for their father's evidence. Yet she could see no signs of activity at the back entrance. Something's happened to them, she told Nalnish during a brief lull in the fighting. The Apache chief had been thinking the same thing. Trap, maybe. Or they found something unexpected. Before Minerva could respond, a new voice cut across the battlefield. Not one of Brennan's men, but someone she recognized with growing horror. Mrs. Blackwood, this is Colonel Harrison, United States Army. Cease fire immediately and surrender. Real federal cavalry was approaching from the south, not Mitchell's fake soldiers, but an actual military patrol with the authority to arrest everyone involved in the conflict. It should have been salvation, but Minerva felt only growing dread. They're too early, she breathed. The girls aren't clear yet. Worse, the arrival of legitimate military authority meant that Brennan would have to accelerate his timeline. He couldn't afford to have federal investigators poking around the mine while James Hartwell and his evidence were still alive to testify. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Brennan would kill the Hartwell parents now before the cavalry could question them. And if the girls were caught inside the mine, "We have to get down there," she told Nalnish desperately. But even as she spoke, she could see it was too late. Brennan's men were already moving toward the mine buildings, their rifles ready for execution rather than battle. The corrupt marshal had decided to cut his losses and eliminate all the witnesses. That's when the real twist revealed itself. The federal cavalry that had seemed like salvation was actually the beginning of something much worse. As the uniformed riders drew closer, Minerva could see details that turned her blood to ice. These weren't regular army uniforms, but a mixture of military and civilian clothing. The men rode with the discipline of soldiers, but they carried weapons and equipment that spoke of mercenary forces rather than legitimate military. "Pinkerton detectives," Nalnish said grimly, recognizing what Minerva had already begun to suspect. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, private investigators for hire, often employed by wealthy industrialists to handle problems that required more violence than the law would allow. If Pinkerton men were involved, it meant the conspiracy reached far beyond the territorial government. "Mrs. Blackwood." The lead rider called out again, his voice carrying the confident authority of a man with unlimited resources behind him. "You're harboring fugitives wanted in connection with territorial land fraud. Surrender now, and you'll be treated fairly under the law." Emma's voice suddenly rang out from near shaft, three clear and strong despite the distance. "Mrs. Minerva, we found them. We found Mama and Papa." The shout revealed that the girls had successfully reached their parents, but it also gave away their position to every armed man within a mile. Brennan's response was immediate and ruthless. "Kill them all," he ordered his men. "No witnesses, no evidence, no problems." What followed was chaos beyond description. Pinkerton men charged toward the mine buildings while Brennan's criminals tried to eliminate the Hartwell family before they could be questioned. Caught in the middle, Minerva and Nalnish found themselves fighting a three-way battle against impossible odds. But the biggest shock was yet to come. As Minerva worked her way down the hillside toward Shaft 3, she caught sight of a familiar figure among the Pinkerton detectives. A man she'd thought was dead for 20 years, a man whose face had haunted her dreams and defined her solitary existence. Tom Blackwood, her husband, was alive and riding with the men who'd supposedly killed him. The revelation hit her like a sledgehammer to the chest. Everything she'd believed about her life, her loss, her identity as a widow, all of it was built on a foundation of lies. Tom saw her at the same moment, his face going white with shock beneath his detective's hat. For an instant, 20 years collapsed into nothing, and they were just a man and woman staring at each other across an impossible gulf of time and betrayal. "Minerva," he called out, his voice carrying all the weight of 2 decades of separation and secrets. "You son of a bitch," she whispered, though her words were lost in the crash of gunfire around them. The man she'd mourned, the memory she'd cherished, the love she'd buried with all her hopes for happiness. He'd been alive all this time, working for the very forces that had destroyed their life together. But there was no time to process the emotional devastation of his reappearance. Emma's scream cut through the noise of battle, high and desperate and full of terror. "They've got Lila. They've got my baby sister." The sight of little Lila being dragged from the mine shaft by one of Brennan's men shattered whatever remained of Minerva's emotional control. The 9-year-old was struggling desperately, her small fists beating uselessly against her captor's chest, her voice raised in a wail of pure terror. "Then let her go!" Emma screamed, breaking from cover near the mine entrance. The 16-year-old was holding an old mining pickaxe like a weapon, her face twisted with rage and desperation. It was exactly what Brennan had been waiting for. His rifle swung toward Emma with practiced precision, the corrupt marshal's face cold as winter stone. "Drop the tool, girl, or I'll put a bullet through your little sister's head." The threat was real and immediate. Brennan had positioned himself so that he could kill either girl with a single shot, using their love for each other as the ultimate weapon. Emma's shoulders sagged in defeat, the pickaxe falling from her nerveless fingers. Behind her, Sarah and both parents emerged from the mine shaft, their hands raised in surrender. James Hartwell's face was grim with the knowledge of defeat, while Margaret Hartwell wept silently at the sight of her youngest daughter in mortal danger. "That's better," Brennan said with savage satisfaction. "Now, Mr. Hartwell, you're going to tell me exactly where you hid those documents, and you're going to do it quickly. My patience is running thin." "I already told you." James replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "The papers are buried under the support beam in shaft 3, marked with 3 notches. Your men should have found them by now." Brennan's smile was cold as death. "They found your decoy cache, yes. Very clever, hiding some old mining reports where we'd expect to find evidence. But we both know the real documents are somewhere else." The revelation that James had prepared multiple hiding places gave Minerva a glimmer of hope. If the evidence was still secure, there might be a chance to save the family and expose the conspiracy. But that hope died when she saw Tom approaching the group, his Pinkerton badge glinting in the harsh sunlight. Her husband, her living, breathing, traitorous husband, looked older than she remembered his face, lined with 20 years of secrets and choices she couldn't fathom. "Hello, Minerva," he said quietly, his voice carrying all the weight of their shared past. "Go to hell, Tom," she replied, her rifle trained on his chest, despite the emotional chaos tearing at her heart. "I know how this looks." He continued, seemingly oblivious to the weapon pointed at him. "But things aren't what they appear to be. I've been working undercover for 20 years trying to build a case against this conspiracy." "Undercover?" Minerva's laugh was bitter as alkali water. "Is that what you call abandoning your wife and son? Is that what you call letting us think you were dead while you ran around playing detective?" The accusation hit Tom like a physical blow, but before he could respond, Brennan interrupted with obvious impatience. "Touching as this reunion is," the corrupt marshal said, "we have business to conclude. Mr. Blackwood, your cover was blown the moment you showed up here. The Pinkertons know you've been feeding information to federal investigators." Tom's face went pale as the implications sank in. "How? Because I told them," Brennan replied with savage pleasure. "Did you really think you could investigate me for 20 years without me noticing I've been watching you, using you, letting you think you were gathering evidence while I fed you exactly what I wanted you to know?" The truth was devastating in its scope. Tom's entire undercover operation had been compromised from the beginning. Worse, his presence here meant that any federal authorities he'd contacted were probably walking into a trap. "The beauty of it," Brennan continued, "is that when the real cavalry arrives, they'll find the bodies of a rogue Pinkerton detective and a group of land fraudsters who killed each other in a dispute over stolen documents. Very neat, very clean, with no loose ends to complicate the official story." Little Lila whimpered in her captor's arms, the sound cutting through the adult's conversation like a knife. She was just a child, innocent of all the adult crimes and betrayals that had led to this moment. But she would die because of them, unless someone acted. Emma caught Minerva's eye and nodded slightly toward a pile of mining equipment near the shaft entrance. The girl had spotted something, maybe a weapon, maybe an opportunity. But any move they made would have to be perfectly timed to have any chance of success. Nalnish was still somewhere on the hillside, but Minerva had lost track of him during the chaotic battle. The Apache warrior might be dead wounded or simply waiting for the right moment to strike. There was no way to know and no time to find out. That's when Sarah surprised everyone. The 13-year-old had been silent since emerging from the mine, apparently cowed by the sight of armed men threatening her family. But now she spoke with the clear, caring voice of someone who'd made a decision. "The real papers aren't in the mine at all," she announced. Papa was too smart to hide them where anyone would think to look. Brennan's attention swung toward her like a weapon seeking a target. "What did you say, girl?" "I said the evidence isn't here," Sarah repeated calmly. "It's in town, hidden where dozens of people see it every day, but nobody notices it." Emma stared at her sister in shock, clearly not knowing whether Sarah was telling the truth or buying time with a desperate lie. Even James Hartwell looked surprised by his middle daughter's revelation. "Where in town?" Brennan demanded, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "The church bell tower," Sarah replied without hesitation. Papa hid the documents inside the bell itself, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed with wax. He said it was the one place in Esperanza that nobody ever bothered to examine closely. The answer was so specific, so detailed, that it had to be either truth or a lie prepared in advance. Brennan clearly believed it, his face lighting up with greedy satisfaction. "Clever man, your father," he said to Sarah. "Too clever for his own good, as it turns out." But James Hartwell was shaking his head slowly, his eyes fixed on his middle daughter with growing understanding. "Sarah," he said quietly, "what have you done?" The 13-year-old's smile was sad, but determined. "What you taught me to do, Papa. I'm protecting the family." The truth hit Minerva like lightning. Sarah hadn't revealed the location of the real evidence she'd sent Brennan and his men on a wild goose chase to buy time for the rest of them to escape. But it was also a suicide mission. The moment Brennan's men reached town and found the church bell empty, they'd return to the mine with blood in their eyes and no patience left for negotiations. "How long do we have?" Minerva asked quietly. 2 hours to Esperanza and back." James replied, his voice heavy with the knowledge of what his daughter had sacrificed. "Maybe 3 if they're careful about searching. 3 hours to find a way out of an impossible situation. 3 hours to save 5 members of the Hartwell family deal with a husband who'd supposedly been dead for 20 years and somehow escape from professional killers with unlimited resources. It wasn't enough time. It wasn't nearly enough. But as Brennan prepared to send half his men to town while keeping the other half to guard the prisoners, Minerva heard something that changed everything, the distant sound of Apache war drums echoing off the hills like thunder before a storm. Nalnish hadn't abandoned them. The Apache chief had gone to summon his people, and now the entire Desert Wind Band was coming to honor their debt and settle their accounts with the men who'd brought death to their sacred places. Brennan heard the drums too, his face going pale as he realized what they meant. "How many?" he asked one of his men. "Well, it's hard to say," came the reply. "Could be 50, could be 100. Apaches are good at making small numbers sound bigger." But Minerva could hear the truth in those drums, the complex rhythms that spoke of many bands coming together, of war parties, gathering from across the territory to face a common enemy. Nalnish had called in every favor, every alliance, every debt of honor that existed among the Apache people. "We need to leave," Tom said urgently, his undercover persona finally cracking under the pressure. "If the Apache are massing for war, this whole area will be a death trap within hours." For once, Brennan agreed with him. "Load the prisoners in the wagon. We'll finish this somewhere more defensible." But as his men moved to obey, Emma made her move. The 16-year-old dove for the pile of mining equipment she'd spotted earlier, her hands closing around a stick of dynamite that some careless miner had left behind. Before anyone could stop her, she had the fuse lit and the explosive held high above her head. "Let my sister go," she said calmly, "or we all die together." The sight of Emma holding lit dynamite froze every man in the camp. Even Brennan, for all his cold-blooded experience, recognized the deadly seriousness in the 16-year-old's eyes. She wasn't bluffing. She was prepared to blow them all to hell rather than watch her family suffer any longer. "Easy, girl," Brennan said, his voice carefully controlled. "That's old dynamite. Unstable. It could go off in your hands." "Good," Emma replied flatly. "That'll save me the trouble of throwing it." The standoff stretched like a wire about to snap. Little Lila hung motionless in her captor's arms, sensing that any movement might trigger catastrophe. Sarah and their parents pressed close together, their faces reflecting the mixture of pride and terror that came from watching a child sacrifice herself for family. Tom stepped forward slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Emma, I know you don't have any reason to trust me, but please listen. There's another way to end this. The way you ended it 20 years ago." Minerva snarled, her rifle still trained on her supposedly dead husband. "By disappearing and letting everyone think you were murdered." "I couldn't tell you," Tom said desperately. "The conspiracy reached too high, had too many connections. If they'd known I was alive, they would have used you and Samuel against me. They killed Samuel anyway." Minerva replied, her voice breaking with 20 years of accumulated grief and rage. "Apache raiders took him while I was trying to hold the ranch together alone. He died calling for his papa, who was too busy playing detective to protect his own son." The revelation hit Tom like a physical blow. His face went white as he absorbed the knowledge that his secret mission had cost him not just his wife, but his child as well. "I didn't know," he whispered. "God help me, I didn't know." "Know this." Emma interrupted, her voice cutting through the emotional chaos like a blade. "I'm going to count to 10. If my sister isn't free by then, we all go to meet our maker together." She began counting each number, falling like a stone into still water. 1, 2, 3. Brennan's men were shifting nervously, their weapons trained on Emma, but useless against an enemy willing to commit suicide. The dynamite in her hands represented mutual destruction, not the ultimate equalizer in a situation where conventional force had failed. 4, 5, 6. That's when the Apache attack began in earnest. The war drums had been building steadily, but now they erupted into a thunderous crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. From every direction came the sound of galloping horses' war cries and the whistle of arrows cutting through the desert air. Nalnish had kept his promise. The Desert Wind Band, joined by warriors from 3 other Apache groups, was descending on the mine like the wrath of ancient gods. The attack was coordinated, overwhelming, and absolutely terrifying in its savage precision. 7, 8. Brennan's defensive positions collapsed within minutes. His men caught between Emma's dynamite, and an Apache war party broke and ran in all directions. The corrupt marshal himself dove for cover behind an overturned minecart, his authority crumbling like sand in a windstorm. 9. The man holding little Lila released her and fled, his nerve finally breaking under the pressure of imminent death. The 9-year-old ran to her parents, who gathered all 3 girls into a protective embrace. Emma let the count die on her lips, but she kept the dynamite ready. The immediate threat had passed, but they were still surrounded by chaos and violence, with no clear path to safety. That's when the real surprise revealed itself. Through the smoke and confusion of battle came a new group of riders, not Apache warriors, but men in the blue uniforms of the United States Cavalry. Real federal soldiers this time, led by an officer whose bearing spoke of genuine authority and unquestionable integrity. "This is Major William Sherman, United States Army." The leader called out, his voice cutting through the noise of battle. "All civilian personnel, lay down your weapons immediately." The arrival of legitimate military authority changed everything. The Apache warriors melted back into the rocks with the fluid grace of men who knew when to fight and when to withdraw. Brennan's surviving men threw down their weapons and raised their hands in surrender. But the biggest shock was yet to come. As the dust settled and the immediate violence ended, Major Sherman approached the group with grim purpose. His first words revealed the scope of what they'd all been caught up in. "The Mr. Thomas Blackwood." He said formally, "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, murder, and treason against the United States government." Tom's face went white with shock. "Major, I'm a federal agent working undercover. I have authorization." "You had authorization," Sherman corrected coldly. Until we discovered you've been selling information to criminal conspirators for the past 5 years. Your own reports led us here, Mr. Blackwood. Reports that were designed to protect Marshal Brennan's operation rather than expose it. The final twist was devastating in its completeness. Tom hadn't been an undercover hero fighting corruption, he'd been a double agent working both sides of the conspiracy for his own profit. His reappearance wasn't redemption, but the revelation of ultimate betrayal. Minerva felt the last of her emotional connections to her husband die. The man she'd loved, mourned, and remembered for 20 years had never really existed. The real Tom Blackwood was a criminal, a traitor, and a coward who'd abandoned his family to pursue wealth and power. Why? She asked quietly, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Tom's response was the final nail in the coffin of their marriage. Because I was tired of being poor, he said simply. Tired of scratching out a living on a worthless ranch, tired of watching other men get rich while I stayed honest and stupid. The confession stripped away any remaining illusions about their life together. Tom hadn't been investigating corruption, he'd been part of it from the beginning. His murder 20 years ago had been staged to give him freedom to operate without the burden of family obligations. Your son. Minerva said, her voice barely a whisper. Samuel called for you when the Apache took him. He died believing his father was dead, when all along you were just gone. For the first time since his reappearance, Tom showed genuine emotion. Tears ran down his weathered face as the full weight of his choices finally hit him. I never meant for Samuel to die, he said desperately. I thought I could finish the job and come back, make enough money to give you both a better life. You gave us death instead, Minerva replied with finality. Samuel's death and the death of everything good in you. Major Sherman interrupted the family tragedy with military efficiency. Mrs. Blackwood, we're going to need your testimony about these events. But first, are you and the children in need of medical attention? Minerva looked at the 3 Hartwell girls, Emma still clutching her unlit dynamite, Sarah and little Lila pressed close to their parents. They were dirty, exhausted, and traumatized, but they were alive and together. That was what mattered. We'll be fine, she said. But these children have been through hell. They need rest, food, and time to heal. They'll have it, Sherman promised. Along with federal protection until this conspiracy is fully rooted out. The corruption you've helped expose reaches from here to Washington, D.C. It's going to take months to arrest everyone involved. As the federal soldiers secured the scene and began processing prisoners, Emma approached Minerva with quiet dignity. Mrs. Minerva, she said formally, my family owes you a debt we can never repay. You saved our lives and helped us save our parents. We saved each other, Minerva replied, echoing Nalnish's words from what seemed like a lifetime ago. That's what families do. The word hung in the air between them, carrying all the weight of shared danger, sacrifice, and love that had grown from desperate circumstances. Are we family now? Little Lila asked with the direct simplicity of childhood. Minerva looked at the 3 sisters, at their parents, who were finally free to hold their children again at the desert that had tested them all so severely. The answer was obvious, written in blood and sand, and the courage of people who'd chosen to stand together against impossible odds. Yes, she said simply, we're family. The federal investigation that followed was the largest corruption case in the history of Arizona Territory. When the evidence hidden in the Esperanza mine was finally retrieved and analyzed, it revealed a criminal network that stretched from local land offices to the halls of Congress. James Hartwell's meticulous documentation, combined with testimony from the surviving participants, resulted in over 60 arrests and the recovery of millions of dollars in stolen property. The territorial government was essentially rebuilt from the ground up with federal oversight to prevent future corruption. Brennan himself was sentenced to hang for multiple murders, though he cheated the gallows by dying of a heart attack in federal custody. Tom Blackwood received 20 years in prison, where he would spend the rest of his life contemplating the cost of his betrayals. But for Minerva and the Hartwell family, the real healing began after the trials ended and the investigators went home. They returned to Minerva's ranch, which had been expanded using reward money from the federal government. The property now included the old Hartwell homestead and enough grazing land to support a substantial cattle operation. Emma proved to have remarkable talent for ranch management, combining her father's attention to detail with her mother's gentle authority. At 17, she was already making decisions that would have challenged experienced ranchers. Sarah's gift for numbers made her invaluable in managing the financial aspects of their expanding operation. The quiet middle sister had developed into a confident young woman whose insights were sought by business leaders throughout the territory. Little Lila, now 11, had become the ranch's unofficial veterinarian. Her natural empathy with animals, combined with careful study of veterinary texts, made her the go-to person for treating sick livestock and wildlife. But the most important change was in Minerva herself. The bitter, isolated widow had transformed into the matriarch of a thriving family enterprise. Her experience combined with the Hartwells' various talents created something none of them could have achieved alone. Mrs. Minerva, Emma said one evening as they sat on the ranch house porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Do you ever regret how things turned out? It was a complex question that touched on everything they'd been through together. The violence, the betrayals, the discoveries that had shattered old assumptions about life and love. I regret the pain, Minerva replied thoughtfully. The deaths, the suffering, the years we all lost to other people's greed and cruelty. But I don't regret finding you girls, or learning the truth about your father's courage, or discovering that families can be chosen as well as born. Margaret Hartwell, who'd been quietly mending clothes on the other end of the porch, looked up with a smile. James always said that the desert had a way of burning away everything false, leaving only what was real and worth keeping. What did the desert leave us with? Sarah asked the philosophical question characteristic of her thoughtful nature. Each other. James replied, emerging from the house with little Lila riding on his shoulders. And the knowledge that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to stand together. It was true, Minerva reflected. None of them were heroes in the traditional sense. They were just people who'd refused to surrender in the face of overwhelming evil. But their refusal had changed the course of territorial history and saved countless innocent lives. Nalnish visited regularly, bringing news from the Apache bands and maintaining the friendship that had grown from mutual respect and shared danger. The Desert Wind people had been granted a permanent reservation that included their traditional sacred sites, one of the few positive outcomes of the federal investigation. The children are growing strong, he observed during one visit watching Emma work with a difficult horse. They have learned that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite fear. They learned that from their parents, Minerva replied, and from you. Your people saved our lives when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Nalnish shook his head slowly. We gained much. We gained allies, friends, and the knowledge that some white people can be trusted to keep their word. These are valuable things in a changing world. The Apache chief's visits always brought news from the outside world, reminders that their small corner of Arizona territory was part of a larger, more complex reality. But those reminders only strengthened their appreciation for what they'd built together. As the months passed, other changes came to the ranch. A young doctor named Michael Corrigan, newly arrived from San Francisco, began courting Emma with the respectful persistence of a man who recognized quality when he saw it. Emma was in no hurry to marry, but she seemed to enjoy his company and his stories of life in the wider world. Sarah had attracted the attention of the territorial superintendent of schools, who wanted to sponsor her education at a women's college back east. The opportunity represented everything James Hartwell had hoped for his daughters, a chance to rise above the limitations of frontier life through learning and determination. Even little Lila had prospects beyond the ranch. Her skill with animals had caught the attention of a traveling veterinarian who offered to take her as an apprentice when she was old enough. "They're going to leave eventually," Margaret said one evening as she and Minerva watched the girls working in the garden. "All children do when they're ready for their own lives." "I know," Minerva replied, though the knowledge carried a bittersweet edge. "But they'll always have a home here, and we'll always be family. That's what matters." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching riders, not the threatening presence that had once meant death and danger, but the welcome sight of neighbors coming to visit. The Martinez family had indeed returned to their reclaimed homestead, and their children had become regular playmates and helpers at the Blackwood Ranch. Other honest settlers had moved into the area as well, creating a genuine community of people committed to building something good from the ashes of corruption. Mrs. Blackwood called out Elena Martinez, the family's teenage daughter. "Mama sent fresh bread, and she wants to know if you need help with the Harvest Festival preparations." The Harvest Festival was a new tradition started the previous year to celebrate not just the gathering of crops, but the triumph of honest people over the criminal conspiracy that had once controlled the territory. It had grown into a regional celebration that drew families from across Arizona territory. "Tell your mother we can use all the help we can get," Minerva replied with a smile. "And ask her if she needs us to bring anything special." As Elena rode away with the message, Emma approached from the corral where she'd been training horses. "Mrs. Minerva," she said, using the formal address that had become a term of endearment over the years. "I've been thinking about what Mr. Nalnish said about courage." "What about it?" "I think the hardest kind of courage is the kind you showed when you first found us in the desert." Emma continued thoughtfully. "It would have been easier to ride past to not get involved. But you stopped anyway, even though it meant risking everything you'd built for yourself." Minerva felt tears prick at her eyes. In the years since their dramatic rescue and the trials that followed, she'd sometimes wondered if her choices had been right. The violence, the danger, the exposure of painful truths, had it all been worth it? "I stopped because I couldn't do anything else," she said honestly. "When I saw you 3 girls dying in the desert, I saw my own family. I saw Samuel and what might have been if someone had helped him when he needed it most. But you saved us instead," Sarah said, joining the conversation with her characteristic directness. "You gave us our lives back, and you gave yourself a new family." It was true, Minerva realized. In saving the Hartwell girls, she'd saved herself from the bitter isolation that had consumed her for 20 years. They'd given her purpose, joy, and the chance to be a mother again. 5 years after the events at the Esperanza mine, the Blackwood Ranch had become one of the most successful operations in Arizona territory. The cattle business was thriving. The horse breeding program had earned recognition throughout the Southwest, and the family's reputation for honesty and fairness had made them leaders in the territorial government. Emma had married Dr. Corrigan and moved to Phoenix, where she was raising 2 young sons and helping her husband establish a hospital for the poor. She visited the ranch regularly, bringing the grandchildren who had become Minerva's greatest joy. Sarah had completed her education in Boston and returned to Arizona as the territory's first female lawyer. Her legal practice specialized in helping settlers who'd been victimized by land fraud and other criminal schemes. The quiet middle sister had found her voice in the courtroom, where her intelligence and moral conviction made her a formidable advocate for justice. Little Lila, now 16 and no longer little, was indeed apprenticed to the traveling veterinarian. but she spent her winters at the ranch treating the animals and learning ranching skills that would serve her well when she eventually inherited the operation. James and Margaret Hartwell had built a new house on their reclaimed homestead, but they spent most of their time at the ranch helping manage the expanding business and caring for their growing number of grandchildren. The success was satisfying, but what mattered most to Minerva was the knowledge that they'd all survived and thrived, despite the attempts to destroy them. The criminal conspiracy that had once seemed so powerful and untouchable had been completely eradicated, replaced by honest government and legitimate business practices. On a warm spring morning, as Minerva sat on her porch reviewing the ranch's financial records, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. Nalnish rode slowly toward the house, his bearing carrying the dignity of age and wisdom earned through decades of survival in a harsh world. "My friend," he said formally as he dismounted, "I bring news from the territorial capital." Minerva set aside her papers and offered him water and shade. Over the years, their friendship had deepened into something approaching kinship, two survivors who'd learned to trust each other completely. "Good news or bad?" she asked. "Both, as is often the case." Nalnish replied with a slight smile. "The territorial legislature has voted to grant statehood status to Arizona. We will soon be equal partners in the United States rather than subjects of federal oversight." It was momentous news. Arizona statehood represented the final triumph of legitimate government over the corruption that had once defined territorial politics. And the bad news? Minerva asked, though she could guess what was coming. "With statehood comes change," Nalnish said quietly. "More settlers, more development, more pressure on Apache lands. My people must adapt or be swept away by progress. What will you do? What we have always done. Survive, adapt, find new ways to honor the old ways." He paused, looking out over the prosperous ranch with its thriving herds and well-maintained buildings. "Perhaps we will follow your example, build something new from the ruins of what was destroyed." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Not the threatening presence that had once struck terror into their hearts, but the welcome sight of family coming home. Emma and her husband were returning from Phoenix with their 2 sons, while Sarah rode alongside them with news from the territorial capital. Even at a distance, Minerva could see the excitement in their faces and the energy of people with important news to share. "Mrs. Minerva," Emma called out as they approached the house, "we have wonderful news." As the family gathered on the porch, 3 generations bound together by choice rather than blood, Emma's announcement revealed the final surprise that would define their future. The territorial government wants to establish a school for training teachers and nurses, she said breathlessly. "They've asked Sarah and me to help design the curriculum, and they want to locate it here on the ranch." The proposal was breathtaking in its scope and implications. A territorial school would bring dozens of young people to the ranch, along with the faculty and resources needed to train the next generation of educators and medical professionals. "It would honor Papa's memory," Sarah added quietly. "He always believed that education was the key to building a better society." Minerva looked around at the faces surrounding her. Emma with her husband and children, Sarah with her legal documents, and dreams of justice, the Hartwells with their quiet satisfaction in work well done. Nalnish with his wisdom and friendship. They'd all survived the worst that corrupt men and an unforgiving land could throw at them. They'd built something good from the ashes of tragedy and betrayal. And now they were being offered the chance to help shape Arizona's future through education and service. "What do you think?" Emma asked. "Should we do it?" Minerva's answer came without hesitation. "Your father would be proud," she said simply. "He fought to expose the truth and died for it. Now we have the chance to make sure future generations know how to recognize and fight corruption whenever it appears." As the family began planning for their new role in territorial education, Minerva reflected on the strange turns life could take. 25 years ago, She'd been a bitter widow alone with her grief and memories. The discovery of 3 dying girls in the desert had changed everything, leading to dangers and revelations she could never have imagined. But it had also led to this, a thriving ranch, a loving family, and the opportunity to help build a better future for Arizona Territory. The desert had indeed burned away everything false, leaving only what was real and worth keeping. As the sun set over their expanded domain, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson, little Lila, no longer little at 16, asked the question that seemed to summarize their entire journey. "Mrs. Minerva, do you think we'll be remembered? Do you think people will know what we did here?" Minerva considered the question carefully. History had a way of forgetting ordinary people who did extraordinary things. The textbooks would probably remember the politicians and generals, the big names, and dramatic events. But that wasn't what mattered. "We'll be remembered by the students who learn in our school," she said finally. "By the families who settle on honest land, sold by honest officials. By the Apache children who grow up knowing that some white people can be trusted to keep their word. And by each other," Emma added with a smile. "We'll remember, and we'll tell our children and grandchildren about the time when good people stood together against evil and won." As night fell over the Arizona desert and the family settled into the comfortable routines of home, Minerva felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived. They'd faced the worst and survived. They'd been tested by fire and emerged stronger. The desert wind carried the scent of growing things, the promise of rain, and the whisper of voices that would never be forgotten. Somewhere in the darkness, night creatures went about their ancient business of survival, while overhead the stars looked down on a land that was finally truly free. In the distance, the lights of other ranches twinkled like earthbound stars, neighbors, friends, fellow survivors building their own dreams from the harsh but honest soil of Arizona Territory. It was a good sight, a hopeful sight, and a fitting end to a story that had begun with death and despair, but concluded with life and love, and the promise of better days to come. The 3 girls who'd been hunted in the desert had grown into strong women who would help shape their territory's future. The widow who'd lost everything had found something better than what she'd lost. And the desert itself, harsh but fair, had witnessed the triumph of courage over corruption, love over hate, and hope over despair. It was enough. More than enough. It was everything.